fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Apple had their Let Loose event this week, and spoiler alert, if you want the newest and fastest, at least single-core performance anyways, Apple Silicon chip, you need to buy an iPad? Yeah, so apparently if you want the latest and greatest and newest chip from Apple, you have to buy an iPad. But we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, so let's first get into this week's trivia question. So in the spirit of Apple has recently been switching their entire lineup from Lightning to USB-C. But what year did they introduce the Lightning connector? So when was the Lightning connector first introduced by Apple? And that is your trivia question for the week. And in other news, in case anyone out there was curious, no, I did not end up buying the Cheyenne supercomputer that went up for auction last week. I did see it, and I was kind of at least jokingly thinking of placing a bid, but I did not, and I did not win the supercomputer. Because quite honestly, I didn't feel like taking out a mortgage to pay the $500,000 or so that it ended up going for. Plus the fact that, can you just imagine what the shipping costs would be to transport or ship something like that? I guess on the one hand, if you have, about $500,000 lying around, probably whatever the shipping cost is just kind of a drop in the bucket for you. But for someone like me, that's definitely would be something that would need to be taken into consideration. And that's also not even to mention the fact that if you wanted to actually use this thing, you would have to take out subsequent mortgages just to operate it. And what I mean by that is this supercomputer operates at 1.75 megawatts. And yes, you heard me right, that is megawatts. Usually when we think about computers and computer components, we're talking about watts, but no, this is megawatts, which is like, what's that, 1,000 kilowatts, and 1 kilowatt is 1,000 watts, so you can do the math, and quite a bit of juice to power this thing. So for context, it's going to cost you thousands of dollars to run per hour and millions to run per year. So you're probably going to be taking out a few mortgages just to pay for the electricity for the thing. And that's, of course, assuming that you have the infrastructure to support a array of computers that's drawing 1.75 megawatts of power. So I hope you got your electrician on the phone for that one. But the kind of the funny thing here is we're talking about this supercomputer that draws 1.75 megawatts, and here I am talking about wanting to reduce my home lab power bill from being around like 425-ish watts and thinking like, man, how can I reduce this? Yet there's a supercomputer drawing orders of magnitude more than that. But if you ask me, though, that 1.75 megawatts number, it's kind of a rookie number, and I think the Cheyenne supercomputer needs to pump those numbers up a little bit, because if you look at the top supercomputers in the world, according to the top 500 list, the number one supercomputer uses 22.7 megawatts. So the comparison of 1.75 megawatts of the Cheyenne supercomputer is quite honestly chump change compared to the 22.7 megawatts of the top supercomputer. But one thing that's also kind of interesting to note about this supercomputer was the amount of RAM that it had. So this supercomputer had more RAM than all of my servers combined, but not, well, obviously, but what I mean is the storage of all of my servers combined. So all of the SSDs and hard drives that I have installed in all of my servers, if you took the combined storage of that, multiplied it by 8, you still would have leftover space for RAM. So this supercomputer had over 313 terabytes of RAM. Yes, you heard me right, 313 terabytes of RAM. And I think the rough math that I did was I think it was the NAS itself is like 36 terabytes, but that's if you exclude the RAID configuration and redundancy. So, and then if you combine the storage from the other servers, I don't know, maybe the raw storage capacity is 48 tops, but that would be like the absolute peak. But when you factor in all of the various redundancy for RAID and that kind of thing, it's probably significantly less than that. But also, for context, in case anyone's wondering, I'm not using anywhere close to that amount of storage. The NAS in particular has somewhere between like 2 and 2.5 terabytes and of storage actually used. And the vast majority of that, I think, probably at least half of it, is basically fully for virtual machine backups. But anyway, getting back to the RAM here, the RAM happened to be DDR4 2400 RAM. So if over the next few months or so you see like a buttload of DDR4 2400 server RAM start flooding the used market, I think we can all have a pretty good idea of where that came from. Also, on the topic of storage, since I just kind of touched on that, the storage capacity for this supercomputer was 36 petabytes. So quite a good chunk of change there for the storage. I'm not entirely sure what all that's made up of. But yeah, kind of as I mentioned, my NAS also has that much if you discount the redundancy and you also move the decimal place over a few times since it's 36 terabytes rather than petabytes. So obviously significant orders of magnitude less. But yeah, that was one thing that I thought was pretty cool to see. It's not every day that you get to see a supercomputer go up for auction. Don't know who bought it or what's gonna become of it, but if you see a lot of server components from around, I think it's Haswell was the processor generation. So if you see a lot of like Haswell related enterprise gear stuff coming up on the used market, we probably know where it's coming from, especially if it's coming from, I think Wyoming was where this supercomputer was based, although that's not to say that whoever ended up buying it was located somewhere else. But if you see server components, DDR4 2400 server RAM or Haswell Gen CPUs or servers or something like that coming out of Wyoming in droves, probably have a good idea of where it's coming from. But with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. Now, for this week's cybersecurity tip, this is one that should be more so common knowledge, but alas, it is not. And that is to keep all of your personal information, so things like personal accounts and personal use, far away from your work devices. Now, there is a reason why the saying, "don't mix business with pleasure," exists, because in case you didn't know, your company is able to see whatever you do on your company-issued device, they have those things monitored quite heavily. Most of the time, at least in my experience, working with different companies, they'll generally have some kind of message that appears like before you log in to your device, basically saying that by logging into the device you agree that the company's able to basically do whatever they want, and you're basically being monitored, basically consenting to all of that. So they kind of basically tell you up front, but of course most people just click the dismiss dialogue or whatever just to continue on their merry way. But it is something that you should be aware of, that they are monitoring what you do on their device that they issued you. So you don't want to be doing things like online shopping, checking personal email or your personal social media accounts. And you absolutely do not want to be job searching on your company device, because I have heard stories of system administrators talking about noticing employees doing like job searching, one on company time, which is obviously a big no-no, and two on the company device, which I don't know if that necessarily led them to being canned, but it definitely wouldn't put a good relationship between you and your upper level management. That is for sure. So not only can your company see this, but it also potentially exposes you and your company, by your company seeing this information, getting access to things about you that maybe you don't necessarily want them to know, or things that they shouldn't know. And also, because basically they're able to gather things about like what you're searching and other things about what you're doing. But another thing that's also important to note is if for whatever reason you're logged into, say, your company device and your personal account gets hacked, there's a chance that that attacker now has access to your company device and could potentially get access to your company network, and that could definitely be some major problems. And essentially what would happen is your company would see that's coming from you and your device, and then you would be in severe hot water. So yeah, just don't do it. And plus, in generally speaking, there is usually some kind of, whether it's in that agreement that you kind of accept when you log into the device, or it's just kind of a spoken rule that they generally don't want you using their company assets for your personal use anyway. So just don't do it. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, moving right along into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? So I talked last week about introducing multi-threading into that asset compiler that I've been working on, and I decided to scrap it. And the reason why I decided to scrap it, at least for the time being, was because I was running into some rather odd edge cases when using threads. So I'd be running into issues where they wouldn't be picking up all the files, or it wouldn't get the name of the file right, and there was just some weird edge cases like that for whatever reason. And there were no Valgrind errors, so it wasn't anything like memory related, and it basically everything screamed that it was a race condition, or essentially multiple threads trying to access the same memory and overwriting it at the same time, which messes things up in when threads run. We've done episodes talking about race conditions in the past, so you can go look those up. But I'm pretty sure that it wasn't a race condition, mainly because all of the variables that would be changing were all local variables. So, and every thread is supposed to, any local variable in a function is like thread local to the thread, so it's not like it should have been overwriting other memory. So I'm not entirely sure what was going on, but the other reason I decided to scrap it was because while it did give a little bit of a speed increase, One, it wasn't by all that much, maybe like a little bit, but it wasn't all that significant. Potentially that could have been due to the lack of assets that I have, since there's currently not many of them, so that potentially could have played a role why there wasn't a ton of speed increase with the threads. But also seeing that, at least as of right now, this whole asset compiler thing is more of just experimentation and testing. I didn't want to necessarily sink a ton of time into trying to get this multi-threaded thing working properly, only to then, realize that this isn't something that I actually want to do long term, and then I spent all this time beating my head against the wall for basically nothing. Of course, it wasn't for nothing, but you kind of get what I'm saying, right? Like, I don't end up using this as the final solution, so don't really want to invest a ton of time into making it super, super polished and how I would want it ideally. Although I guess that kind of goes back to the old saying of the temporary solution is the permanent solution, kind of a joke in the software development area anyway. But with that, so I did finally manage to begin actually integrating the asset compiler into the project itself. So I got the source code included, cleaned up the makefile a little bit to better integrate it with the project as a whole, and then updated the main makefile for the project to essentially include the asset compiler as a dependency and build it as needed, assuming it is needed and I want to do an embedded build where I convert the various assets to .h files. And of course, if I do want to make an embedded build, it will also convert all of the asset files to header files in order for the program to compile properly. Because of course, if every asset, like all the images and fonts and everything, are .h files and they don't exist, and my source code is trying to include it, that's of course going to fail to compile. So now at this point, all I need to do is actually update the actual program's code itself, and essentially just do some if-def checks just to see if the compiler flag that I added in the makefile when I compile is present or not, and if it is, then do the code to integrate the embedded version. Otherwise, just do like what I'm doing right now and just pull it from the file system. So those were the updates. Not necessarily a ton, but I've been kind of doing some other things this week, so I didn't necessarily have a ton of time to work on this, but I did at least manage to get some progress, and getting that finally integrated into the project itself was definitely a pretty big win in my book. So now let's move on to that Apple event. So first, how about them iPads? Am I right? So this, of course, was Apple's Let Loose event where they discussed new iPads that they were bringing out, which quite honestly was about time, since I think the last time they had an update for any iPad was, I believe, a year and a half ago or over a year ago. It's been a while. So they did come out with some new updates. RIP, the iPad mini, not because they killed it, but because they didn't touch it at all. So it is unchanged from the previous iPad mini. The base iPad they didn't really touch on, but they did kill the 9th gen iPad, so now only the 10th gen one exists. The 10th gen one, if you forgot, was the one that finally adopted the new, well, I guess it's not necessarily new anymore, since the design language that came around with the 2018 iPad Pro that they've been like kind of slowly migrating other design language for other products, especially iPads, over to. That's the 10th gen iPad. So that's the only base iPad that they sell. But they did drop the price from $450 down to $350. So that was a nice $100 price drop there. But getting into the iPads that they actually updated, the first one they updated, which was quite honestly just a spec bump, was the iPad Air. Now, the one thing I guess to note is technically there's I think the 10.9 inch they're technically calling it 11 inches, although I'm not exactly sure if that's still 10.9, since they had some weird, like, um, like fine print to like the sizes. But anyway, they're marketing an 11 inch and now also a 13-inch iPad Air, but otherwise the design is basically unchanged aside from them moving the front-facing camera to now a landscape orientation, which is something that they did on the 10th gen iPad whenever they updated that. And it also gets the M2 chip. So if your iPad Air with the M1 chip was feeling very sluggish for some reason, now there's a faster version. But I guess one of the more big updates is the iPad Air now starts with 128 gigs of storage. So that is a nice little bump right there. And as far as pricing goes, the pricing for the 11-inch iPad Air is $600, and the pricing for the 13-inch is $800, or I guess technically $599 and $799. But overall, not a ton of updates to the iPad Air, and it is going to be available May 15th. I believe you can order them now, but they'll be available starting on May 15th. Also, the other thing that they updated and spent the most of the time on was the iPad Pro, which now has an 11-inch, which is the same as before, but the 12.9 inch is now a 13-inch size. Similar to the iPad Air, it's also going to be available on the 15th. And they also managed to shrink the dimensions of the iPad Pro, so it's now 5.3 and 5.1 millimeters thin for the 11-inch and 13-inch respectively. So that technically makes the 13-inch iPad Pro the thinnest device that Apple has ever created. And they did like this kind of marketing thing where they put it up next to, I believe it was the iPod Nano, I think, or one of like the older iPods, and which used to be the king as far as like the thinnest Apple device ever, and they put it next to it and showed that it was thinner, which was kind of cool. It also gets the front-facing camera in a landscape orientation now, and they are also touting that the thermal design is better. I think they said they put some like copper between like where the Apple logo is, and they're claiming a 20% better thermal performance compared to the previous generation. And here comes the juicy bit, because the iPad Pro has the brand new M4 chip. So that is correct. If you want the latest Apple Silicon chip, you need to buy an iPad, which is kind of weird to say. I don't know if I'm necessarily surprised that they went with the M4. I mean, if they had the M4 ready, there's no sense in putting an M3 in it if you have the M4. But it's like you came out with the M3 like 6 months ago ish, something like that, and the MacBook Airs had like got the M3 chip. What was that? A couple months ago. So, kind of some people that just got the M3 chip might be feeling a little shortchanged. Although based on some potential rumors and whatnot, it doesn't sound like M4 chips are going to be coming to Macs until the end of 2024. So yeah, it sounds like if you want the latest chip and you don't want to wait another, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, maybe 6, you're gonna have to get an iPad Pro here. So it is their second generation 3 nanometer technology. So the M3 chip was the first Apple series chip, and I believe first chip in general that was on 3 nanometers as far as like the transistor size, and this is their second generation of that. And they've redesigned the architecture, so it is now 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores, at least on the upper end spec, for a total of 10 cores. And the binned version of the M4 chip has 3 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores for a total of 9. And comparatively to their previous baseline chips, so the M1 through the M3 had 4 performance and 4 efficiency each, so a little bit of a spec bump there for your efficiency cores. And Apple is claiming that the M4 chip is 50% faster than the M2, which some people have pointed out that this is kind of cherry-picked for better performance. But to Apple's credit, the old iPad Pro did have an M2 chip, so it does kind of make sense that you're comparing the previous chip in the iPad Pro to the current new chip that's going to be in the iPad Pro. But at the same time, some people are making the argument, I would argue rightly so, that they also should have compared it to the M3, which they didn't at all. But then again, the M3 was also kind of a minor bump to the M2, so you can potentially kind of do some math to figure out what the actual differences are. And the M4 GPU, similar, I think, to the previous gens, has a 10-core GPU, and Apple is claiming a 4 times GPU performance compared again to the M2. And the neural engine they're touting can perform 38 trillion operations per second. So can only imagine what kind of AI stuff they're going to be bringing to WWDC, which is something that people have been speculating about for a while now. Is that WWDC 2024, in about a month's time, the new operating systems are going to focus heavily on artificial intelligence, because in case you've been living under a rock for the past 2 years, AI has been kind of the name of the game, and if you want your stock price to do what people want it to do, and that is up and to the right, you pretty much have to integrate AI into your product line, your software, whatever, regardless of how either well it's implemented or if it's just a marketing term, whatever the case may be. AI has been quite an arms race the past few years. And Apple has been fairly absent from the AI race, at least up to this point. But they have been building up their neural engine the past few generations of chips and touting the machine learning performance that you can get with these chips, and adding different machine learning capabilities to their software development kits that developers can tap into. So they definitely haven't been shying away from the whole AI sphere, but they haven't necessarily dove head in and launched their own large language model or anything like that. But some of the rumors are, with these new advancements in the neural engine specifically, that they're going to potentially try to do some on-device large language models or some other kind of artificial intelligence. Maybe Siri will finally get a much needed update. But because if you have used other similar products, for instance, not too long ago, the Humane AI Pin and the Rabbit R1 were released, and some of the biggest complaints about those devices was how slow they are. And the reason they're so slow is because all of the queries that you ask it are basically going to the cloud and back, which we can get into why that is horrible for numerous reasons, especially when it comes to privacy. But regardless, there is a lot of overhead in the sending of your query to the cloud to do its cloud computation and send you back the result for the device to then tell you. So if you're able to do that all locally on the device through something like the neural engine, that will not only make the response to your queries a heck of a lot faster, but it's also a lot more secure and private because everything is happening locally on the device and nothing is going out to the cloud and being queried there and most likely logged somewhere for further training. Now, that's not to say that just because something is happening locally on your device, a copy of your query and the response aren't being sent out after the fact. I'm not saying Apple does that. I'm just saying that is something that could potentially happen. So don't necessarily assume that just because something is happening locally, it's not also being sent out to someone else for records, for whether that's data collection or whatever the case may be. Since while, yes, ideally, you'd want something to be done all locally because, for reasons we already talked about, speed improvements and privacy implications. Just because something's done locally doesn't guarantee the fact that it's not being, still sent out to someone else at a later time. It's just that, obviously, if you're sending the data to the cloud to do the processing, it's already on the cloud, so it, can easily be logged. And generally with how these back-end server applications work, they're pretty much logging every connection, every piece of data that comes through for either data analysis or to do their own training or whatever the case may be. It's getting logged. But at least if it's happening locally on the device, there's a chance that it potentially, and usually in Apple's case, doesn't actually end up leaving your device at all, which would be fantastic for both privacy and security as well. So getting back into the specs of the M4 chip, the unified memory bandwidth is now got upped from 100 gigabytes per second to 120 gigabytes per second. So this is the first base increase of the memory bandwidth for all of the base M series chips. This is the first time that there's actually been an increase in that. Now, I did mention that there is a binned version and a higher-end full-spec version. So the binned version that had the 3 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores and also 8 gigs of RAM is coming in the 256 gig and 512 gig models. So if you do want the higher-end spec M4 chip with the 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores and with 16 gigs of RAM, you have to upgrade to the 1 terabyte or the 2 terabyte model in order to get access to that. And we will touch on a little bit later the displays that are used. But actually, I'll just wait till we get to the displays. But one other thing about the chip is, according to some leaked Geekbench results, and the reason I say kind of leaked, kind of put it in air quotes, is because technically speaking, I mentioned the M4 iPad Pro isn't available until May 15th, yet somehow there are Geekbench results from the iPad Pro already online. So theoretically, these are from like early review units or something that, reviewers have already got early access to and are running Geekbench tests is kind of my assumption. So that's why I kind of use the word leaked. But anyway, the Geekbench results show that the M4 chip has the fastest single-threaded score, at least according to Geekbench, for any chip in the world. So technically, at least for consumers, but I think it's for all chips in general, the M4 chip is the fastest single-threaded chip in the world. So yeah, if you want the fastest single-threaded chip in the world, you need to buy an iPad Pro, which is kind of weird to say because usually, your fastest, CPUs are in monster servers or desktops, usually desktops or workstations, because generally speaking, server chips often opt for more cores and higher multi-threaded performance rather than strictly single-threaded performance. Because if you put the M4 chip up against, a new server chip or even one of the higher-end desktop chips from Intel, it's not going to win in multi-threaded performance or multi-core performance. But the single-threaded or a singular core doing a task, it does rank higher. So getting back into some other stuff about the M4 iPad, it has a new tandem OLED display, and basically what this means is they put essentially layered 2 OLED screens on top of one another, and by doing this, they're able to achieve 1,000 nits of brightness and 1,600 nits of peak brightness for HDR content, and they're calling it, in true Apple fashion, the Ultra Retina XDR display. And I don't know if it gets more Apple than that when it comes to the naming scheme. So you gotta love Apple's naming schemes for things like that. Now, if this is to make this, I guess, any weirder, there is a bit of a downgrade in the M4 iPad Pro, and that is there is only one camera on the back. So the previous iPad Pro had two cameras on the back. One, I believe, was just kind of the standard camera, and the other was the ultra wide. But on the new M4 iPad Pro, the ultra wide has gone the way of the dinosaurs and is no longer present. And similarly to the iPad Air, in regards to cameras, the front-facing camera is now in landscape orientation. So when you're having your FaceTime calls or other, video calls, if you have your iPad horizontally, you're not, looking at the screen, and based on what your camera is showing, you're kind of looking off somewhere else, which was something that was always kind of a weird quirk of the iPad, where if you were looking directly at the screen or who you were FaceTiming or whatever, it would always look to them anyway that you were kind of looking slightly off to, the right or the left, depending on how you had your iPad oriented, because the camera was at, the top or off to the left or the right, and you're, of course, looking right in the middle of the screen, which isn't at the camera, so it would sometimes look like you're not actually looking at the person you're talking to. So that is one nice thing to see, that they move that camera around. And they also are introducing a nano-textured glass, which essentially kind of reduces the reflections off the screen. So if you're in a very well-lit environment, you're not going to get a bunch of reflections shining back into your face, which is pretty nice. Although the nano-textured glass option is only available on the 1 and 2 terabyte models. So if you want the higher-end chip, or you want the nano-textured glass, you're going to have to splurge and spend some more money and opt for one of those higher base storage models. And of course, we know the storage prices on Apple devices definitely does not come cheap. But one other interesting feature that they brought up for the iPad Pro, at least when they were talking about it, was an update to Final Cut for the iPad, which has like this multicam feature. So basically you can have multiple like iPhones, or I think even iPads potentially, set up in different angles and orientations, and then on your iPad you can essentially pick between which camera you want to have, displaying. So kind of like you're in a control room of like some video production suite, and you can, select which camera to be actively showing, which is definitely pretty cool. But to me, that kind of seems like something more that they would mention at a WWDC than an iPad event. But, what do I know, I guess? So the 11-inch... So now here's where it gets interesting, right? So we talked about these updates, and the 11-inch now starts at a cool $999, which is up from the previous 11-inch iPad Pro, which was $799, and the 13-inch is now up to $1299. Previously, the 12.9-inch before was 11, or I think it was $1099. So $200 price increase across the board. But to their credit, they did up the base storage from 128 gigs to 256 gigs. And if we want to be total Apple sheep, we can really justify this price increase because, one, you're getting double the storage, two, you're getting a much improved chip, and three, you're getting a much improved screen with that tandem OLED display. So you could argue, that's $200 of value right there. But yeah, so they did, of course, up the price. And the thing that we'll get into once we get into the accessories that they touched on, you can easily spend significantly more money on an iPad Pro than you can on just a basic Apple laptop like a MacBook Air, which is kind of bonkers. But getting into those accessories, they did announce a new Magic Keyboard. But one thing I should note is that this isn't replacing the previous Magic Keyboard. That still exists in their lineup. But this new Magic Keyboard now has a function row, a larger trackpad made of aluminum, and the trackpad now has haptic touch. So if you've used a MacBook since I think like 2015, that feature on the trackpads is what's known as haptic touch, or a force touch trackpad, and that is essentially being brought to the Magic Keyboard. Now here is where things continue to get a little murky. The new Magic Keyboard is only compatible with the M4 iPad Pro, and the M4 iPad Pro is not compatible with the previous Magic Keyboard. And all of the new iPad Airs that just came out are compatible with the previous version of the Magic Keyboard, but not this one. As a consolation prize, the Magic Keyboard, this new Magic Keyboard, is the same price as the previous one, so $299 for the 11-inch and $349 for the 13-inch. So that's, I guess, nice to see. But then they also announced a brand new Apple Pencil that they are calling the Apple Pencil Pro, and it has new sensors in it to basically detect if you're squeezing it. Another feature that's pretty cool, and some people, I guess, have been asking for, is it now has Find My support. So you can, if you happen to lose your Apple Pencil, you can find it through the Find My feature on your phone or your Mac or whatever. Another thing that was really cool about it is it also has a built-in gyroscope in it, so it can detect if you're rolling the pencil, so it can switch between options, or it can add different paintbrush effects depending on how you have it oriented, which is definitely really cool. And I think a lot of people that do any kind of artwork on their iPad are definitely going to enjoy. And again, where things start to get a little weird is this new Apple Pencil Pro is only compatible with the M4 iPad Pro and the M2 iPad Air, which is a little interesting because if you remember, or if you were listening closer to the podcast, there was an M2 iPad Pro, and in theory, as far as chips are concerned, the M2 iPad Pro has the same chip as the M2 iPad Air, but the M2 iPad Pro is not compatible with the Apple Pencil Pro, but the M2 iPad Air is. So that's a little interesting. So just to recap here, the only iPads that the Apple Pencil Pro is compatible with is the two new ones that just got announced this week, which is the M4 iPad Pro and the M2 iPad Air. But it gets even more confusing, because if you thought the confusion was already high, we are going even higher. Somehow, according to Apple's own website, the second generation Apple Pencil, which is the one that's been used on all the previous iPad Pros, is not compatible at all with the new iPad Pro and iPad Air. So not exactly sure how that works. But the previous iPad or Apple Pencil that was used for, these newer generation style iPads is not compatible with the two new ones that just got released. I guess as a consolation prize, this new Apple Pencil Pro is the same price as the second gen Apple Pencil. And what's also interesting is all of the Apple Pencils that Apple has ever created, I believe, are still all for sale on their website. So that is also interesting. But the thing that, I kind of find weird about this is, first off, the second gen Apple Pencil doesn't work on the new iPads, and the fact that this new Apple Pencil Pro only works on the new iPads. And the other thing that's, I guess, kind of a bummer for you if you previously had a full-blown iPad Pro setup, is you basically have to get a completely new iPad Pro setup. So if you were one of those people that had an iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard and second gen Apple Pencil, if you want to fully recreate your current setup, you have to buy all those things again. So unlike previous years where you could just upgrade your iPad and keep the Magic Keyboard and Apple Pencil, you got to upgrade them all again, assuming that you want to keep that same ecosystem. So some very interesting choices that were made here. Definitely some cool features and upgrades to the iPad Pro. That M4 chip, at least for how iPadOS currently is, I think is definitely overkill. But who knows? WWDC is literally a month away, so there could be some serious new features coming to iPadOS that could take serious advantage of this new M4 chip. I guess we'll just kind of have to wait and see on that. But yeah, it was a pretty interesting event. Kind of, only focusing on iPads, which is a little interesting because I'm pretty sure when they announced Final Cut for the iPad, which was like a huge deal, that was just a press release. Yet they had an entire event dedicated strictly to iPads here. So that was definitely interesting to see. But yeah, so the thing that really, I think for me personally, that I was most excited about this event was, of course, the M4 chip. Because for me, I'm not necessarily a big iPad user personally. I do have, I think, technically 2 iPads. I don't use them. One of them is the original iPad, just kind of as a collector's thing. And the other one, I think it was the first gen, I want to say it's a first gen iPad mini. And the main reason I got it was because it looked cool since it was like completely all black and everything. And I thought it was cool. But it's basically unusable because it runs iOS, I think 9.3.5? Is that what it is? I don't remember. Whatever the last version of iOS 9 is, that's basically unusable and slow as heck. So I never use it. But I am really excited to see this M4 chip and see what other variants Apple makes with the M4 Pro, M4 Max, maybe M4 Ultra. Be definitely interested to see what kind of performance numbers those pump out and see these things in Max, because I don't know, I might have to upgrade to one. I don't know, since your boy's still out here on Intel. So it might become come due here soon that I might have to make the transition to Apple Silicon, even though it's been out for over 4 years at this point. But anyway, that was the Let Loose event. Again, like I said, the thing I really liked seeing and I'm really looking forward to in the future is the M4 chip and where they go with that in the future, especially how they bring it to the Mac. So with that, let's wrap this episode up with our trivia question. So this week's trivia question is, Apple has been recently switching over their entire lineup of devices to USB-C from Lightning. But what year did they first introduce Lightning? If you said 2012, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And quick bonus points if you remember what the first iPhone with Lightning was. If you guessed the iPhone 5, congratulations, you got the bonus trivia question correct, so props to you. And if you enjoyed this episode, please give it a rating and review. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. If you're on YouTube, be sure to leave it a like and subscribe. Leave a comment below. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode, or you have any topics or potential ideas for future episodes, you can either leave a comment on YouTube or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. The link for that is in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.